everyone doing? It's Dr. Roddenberry coming to you from Willow Springs, North Carolina on a fine Tuesday morning. Hope everybody's doing well. Semester's going okay. We're just getting started into the swing of things. Some of you probably even have an exam coming up in the next day or in the next week or two. Our exam is still a few weeks off, but I'll bet you're starting to turn things in. How's everybody doing today? If you're out there in virtual world, check in and say hello in the chat bar. Let me know how you're doing. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 2, Biopsychology. Good morning, Angelina. It's good to see you. Thanks for coming today. So we're getting ready to talk about biopsychology. If you think about it, this is probably the most fundamental part of the class because biopsychology is really going to set sort of the it's it's what everything's based on. Every behavior you have, every thought you have, every feeling you have, all of this somehow or another is related to the functioning of your nervous system. So it's quite fundamental that you have a good understanding of how the brain is organized, what it's composed of, and how the parts of the brain, the nervous system, work together. And that's what we're going to talk about for the next couple of days. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time, so we can't go into a ton of detail. There are literally, we could spend an entire semester talking about the nervous system and still not even completely give you a complete understanding of how it works. However, what we're going to do is try to introduce to you just sort of some of the basic definitions and ideas uh, that form the neurology of your functioning. Good morning. I see we have a couple of other people here. Let's go ahead and jump into our PowerPoint today. So today we're going to talk about how the nervous system's organized. We're going to talk a little bit about the anatomy and physiology of the neuron, and we're going to talk about chemicals and how they relate to brain functioning. We're going to talk about neurotransmitters such as serotonin and dopamine. I'll bet those things are things that you heard. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how psychoactive drugs like alcohol, THC, and other chemicals affect brain functioning. Okay, and then we'll talk a brief moment about hormones, which are sort of another part of the nervous system. So let's talk briefly about the nervous system. Keep in mind that the nervous system is your way of monitoring and modulating your behavior to allow you to survive in a difficult and changing environment. Your nervous system is primarily designed, think of it as an organ in a sense, if you will, and its function is to provide you information about the environment around you so that you can make strategic choices, right? Just like your stomach digests things, just like your heart pushes blood around your body, your nervous system provides information in response to that information. Now, the nervous system is it can be found in the entirety of your body. So your stomach's down here, your heart's right here, but your nervous system is everywhere because every part of your body needs to provide information to the brain, and your brain controls every part of your body. If you will look over here at the side, you'll see the typical organization of the nervous system as it's presented to introductory students. You'll notice that we have two colors in this image. You have your pink and red brain and cerebellum, sort of your red colors. And then you'll notice you have all of these other blue nerves, if you will. These represent the two fundamental organizational parts of the nervous system. Your brain and your spinal cord are considered to be central. They are part of your central nervous system. They are the part of your brain that receives and responds to information. So your brain's where you think about all the things you want to do and decide what the best strategy is. So your brain receives input, and sometimes it automatically controls some behavior and it carefully controls other behavior. So your brain is a decision maker. And you probably didn't know this, but your spine is also a decision maker too. Your spine controls reflex responses. When you touch something super duper hot and your reflex is to pull your hand away, that movement is controlled by your spine. So all of your reflexes, these very simple stereotypic responses to the environments, are controlled by your spine. But if you think about it, your spine and your brain on top of your head are your decision making centers. Now, the blue lines represent nerves that extend from your central nervous system to all parts of your body, to your muscles, to your skin, and to your internal organs. And these are the pathways that bring information from the external world to your brain. The blue part of your body, or the peripheral nerves, are not decision makers. They are information carriers. They carry information to your brain and spinal cord, and then actions and plans decided on by your brain and spinal cord travel along them to the different parts of your body. So sometimes if you're an EMT person or a medical doctor, we talk about whether or not the damage is central. When we talk about people losing having difficulties neurologically, we try to assess whether or not the damage is centrally or peripherally. If you have peripheral nerve damage, that means one of your nerves is cut and can't send the information to your brain. If you have central nerve damage, that means the part of your brain that controls that body part is malfunctioning. So we typically differentiate between central and peripheral nerves. Now, if you'll notice underneath the peripheral nervous system, it talks about somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. We're going to talk more about the autonomic nervous system in detail when we get to stress and coping. But what I want you to know is that we typically differentiate between the nerves that go from our brain to our internal organs, and we differentiate those from the nerves that go from our brain to our muscles. So the nerves that control our muscles and allow us to consciously feel things are called the somatic nerves. And the nerves that go to our internal organs are referred to as autonomic nerves, right? So you are in control of your body. You can move things, you can feel things, but you don't really feel or control your heart. You don't really feel or control your stomach. Those things are controlled automatically by your brain. Does everybody understand the how this organizational strategy for the brain? I'm going to want you to know the difference between structures of your nervous system that are central and how they're different from the peripheral nervous system. And later on in this semester, we're going to talk in detail about the difference between the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. Now, so we've got this. This is the big overall structure of what the nervous system looks like. Now, this entire nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord, all these peripheral nerves are composed of these building blocks in our brain. So your body is composed of cells, you know that. Well, your nervous system is composed of specific cells called neurons that communicate information, and glial cells, which serve to support uh, the function of the neurons. These two types of cells are the building blocks of your nervous system. Now let's talk about them both in detail here. Neurons. Neurons are actually one-way communication cells that allow one part of your brain to communicate to another part of your brain. Neurons may be microscopic, sending their message this far, or some neurons have axons that may be over a foot long. And what it allows to happen is for one part of your brain to be stimulated and then send a message to another part of your brain to cause it to be stimulated. Good morning, Mosen. So, neurons are one-way. Now, neurons are one-way communication cells. You have one neuron that sends an information from this part of the brain to this part of the brain, you know what? You have to have another neuron that sends communication from this part of the brain back to this part of the brain. So they're one-way communication cells. And we're going to talk about this in just a minute. They communicate doing two-way with two methods. One part of the brain will release a chemical called a neurotransmitter, and that chemical will cause the neuron in that area to generate a pulse of electricity that travels to another part of your brain. So we typically say that neurons function electrochemically. So chemicals are released in one part of your brain. They cause a neuron to generate a pulse of activity that then travels to another part of the brain. So neurons are one-way communication cells. You know, I'd like to even, let's see, I think I've got a picture of them. Yeah, I've got a couple of pictures of them. Take a look at this. Do you see this? This is a neuron right here. And as you can see, it's got these long, stringy arms. You see the thing in the middle of this is the cell body, and it's got these long, stringy arms that reach out in different directions. And you can stimulate one of those arms with a chemical, and that will cause this neuron to generate electricity, which runs out the lengths of the other arms. So they're long, spidery looking things. Here's a picture of another neuron. See, it's a little bit different, but it's still the same thing. You've got these arms that reach out and are sensitive to chemicals. And when one of them gets stimulated by a neurotransmitter chemical, it sends that information back to the middle of the neuron, that cell body there, which then generates electricity, which runs out the length of the other parts of the neuron. No, you were in the wrong class, Ron Muse. You need to be here at 10 o'clock. Go back to the email I sent, or the text I sent early this morning. Actually, it'll come out in about 15 minutes. You're in the wrong class, big guy. Okay? Does anybody have any questions about what these neurons look like? Let's go back to the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so as you can see from this picture below me, neurons come in all shapes and sizes. So you'll notice that you have sensory neurons that are responsible for sensing your world and sending that information from your peripheral nervous system all the way back to your brain. And then you have these motor neurons, and they're the one-way communication cells that send instructions from your brain to your muscles, right? These pyramidal neurons are very important in your cerebellum, and they're responsible for helping you coordinate the movement between your different body parts. So you'll notice that we have all kinds of different shapes for our neuron cells. I'll explain in more detail about the parts of a neuron in just a second, but I'd like to talk about these things called glial cells. Glial cells are the support structures that help support the functioning of the neurons. They make them communicate faster. They help speed up the electrical impulses that these neurons generate. And they're also responsible for cleaning up intracellular garbage that accumulates as the chemicals are released around neurons. You get sort of cellular garbage that's left, and your glial cells are responsible for cleaning up the garbage so that that little chemical communication process can happen more effectively. Now, if you look down on the bottom of this image right here, you'll see that we also have different shapes and different types of glial cells: astrocytes, Bett cells, microglia. You've got these things called neuroagliodendroglias and Schwann cells. You have different kinds of glial cells. It goes beyond the scope of this class, but these glial cells are responsible for insulating neurons to make them transmit electricity faster and for cleaning up intracellular waste. Have any of you ever heard of multiple sclerosis or amyolateral sclerosis. These types of disorders occur when when these glial cells start to disintegrate. So if you look at this, okay, you have heard this, fantastic. Okay, if you look at the picture I'm showing you right here, do you see where it says myelin in the top of this picture? Sort of these yellow sausage looking things that are on the outside of an axon. This myelin is composed of glial cells, lots of little glial cells, and you see they sort of function like insulation on a neuron. Well, what you'll notice in a demyelination disorder is you're going to see that these little bundles of myelin will start to disintegrate, and as they start to disintegrate, the nerves that uh, they control will start to will start to malfunction. Oh no, I shouldn't have done that. Whew. All right, let's see. We'll go back to the PowerPoint presentation. All right, sorry about that. Okay, here we go. So we've got these glial cells. Now there are actually 10 times as many glial cells as neurons. And the neat thing is, you're born with pretty much the most of the neurons you're going to need for the rest of your life. But what develops in your brain after you're born are these glial cells. And if you've ever seen when infants are born, they are pretty useless. They can't move their arms, they can't talk, they can't think. Well, what happens is as these glial cells in this grow in the brain and insulate the neurons, the baby begins to develop their abilities. They learn how to walk, they learn how to hold things. And this all occurs because the baby's glial cells are growing and insulating the neurons that they serve. I hope that makes sense. I don't know if I've bored you or lost you at this point. Now, there are lots of different types of neurons in the world. Let me go ahead and disappear here for a minute. But all neurons have the same basic structures that I'd like for you to be familiar with, okay? So if you look at the bottom of this page, you'll see what's known as the prototypical neuron. This is the neuron you're going to see in almost every introductory class that demonstrates the parts of the neuron. Some neurons look different, as I showed you in the pictures earlier, but all neurons have these basic features right here. Now, if you look at this neuron, we're going to go left to right. So as you're looking at this picture, information, remember, as I said, neurons are one way. So information comes into the dendrites on the left side of this neuron in the form of chemical stimulation. And if it's stimulated enough, that neuron will generate an electrical impulse that will travel from left to right as designated by the arrow you see here. Does everybody see that? Okay. So what do the parts of the neuron do? Well, you have these dendrites that are responsible, have proteins on them that are sensitive to chemical stimulation from a very, very specific type of chemical. So you have different dendrite proteins on these dendrites, and each one is sensitive to stimulation, is activated only by certain chemicals. So these dendrites are responsible to stimulation from neurotransmitter molecules. So you have serotonin receptor sites, you have dopamine receptor sites, you have acetylcholine receptor sites, and these dendrites will have different combinations of receptor sites that are sensitive to chemical stimulation. Now, here's the deal. They bring information in. Now, this information is either excitatory or inhibitory. So sometimes these chemicals will make the neuron become more depolarized and more likely to generate electricity. Some of these chemicals will come in and they will make the neuron less depolarized and less likely to generate a pulse of electricity. So your dendrites are sort of receiving chemical stimulation. Some of this stimulation is telling the neuron to generate electricity. Some of this chemical stimulation is telling the neuron not to generate a pulse of electricity. All right. Now, these dendrites are receiving chemical stimulation second by second, moment by moment, hundreds of thousands of receptor sites, and they're transmitting this information to the cell body. The cell body is sort of like the control center of the neuron. It's going to contain the nucleus of the cell, all right, which does all the typical stuff that the nucleus of a cell does. But more importantly, it's receiving this excitatory or inhibitory messaging from the dendrites. If it's stimulated by enough excitatory chemicals relative to inhibitory chemicals, it becomes depolarized. This then causes it to generate a pulse of electricity called an action potential, which travels down the length of the axon, just like a spark. So imagine one quick spark shooting down the length of this neuron from the cell body on the left all the way to the terminal buttons on the right. This pulse of electricity then travels down the length of the axon all the way to the terminal buttons. Now, these terminal buttons hold collections of more chemicals called neurotransmitters. And when they're stimulated electrically, by the action potential, they release their chemicals. So let's go back and talk about this. You've got the dendrite. Let's see, maybe we should even go here, right here. So in a sense, if you've got your neuron, it receives chemical stimulation. Okay, there's your terminal button. And then it generates electrical pulse, which then releases chemicals in another place. Does that make sense? So your neuron's a communicator. So this is place one, and this is place two. So chemicals being released right here can stimulate a neuron, which then generates a pulse of electricity that travels to another place and causes chemicals to be released here. I hope this makes sense. This may not make sense. So you've got these dendrites. Their job is to receive the chemical stimulation. If they receive enough stimulation, they cause the cell body to generate a pulse of electricity. This pulse of electricity travels down an axon. The axon is nothing more than a long root-like projection from the cell body, and it provides a connection to the next neuron, right? Now, when it gets all the way to the end of the axon, it has these little sacs filled with chemicals. These chemicals are called neurotransmitters, and they're released in a different part of the brain. Now, if you'll notice, the one thing I haven't talked about is the myelin sheath. You'll see the myelin sheath is those sausage-looking coatings, sausage-looking things that are along the length of the axon. The glial cells that develop in your body start to grow and wrap around the axons after you're born. And what happens is these glial cells grow and they act as if they are an insulating cover on the axons. And what this does is this causes the electrical impulse to move even faster down the length of the axon. It actually speeds up the activity in your brain. Okay? And so anytime you have a disorder which causes damage to the myelin sheath, it's going to be the same thing as if the power cord or the cord to your lamp in your house gets frayed. If that insulation comes off, your electrical device will short out and won't work properly. The same thing happens. The same thing happens in demyelination disorders. Now, on the exam, I'm going to want you to know what these things do, what your dendrite does, what your cell body does, uh, where what your axon does, and what your terminal buttons do, and what your myelin sheath does. And I want you to know the name for that pulse of electricity is an action potential. I've already made up the questions for this particular exam, and I promise you, I made them up last week, and I promise you, I asked a couple of questions about this. If you don't have any, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to stop me and ask them. Now, what I want to do is I want to take a moment and talk about what happens between the dendrites and the terminal buttons. Notice if you look at this picture right here, these terminal buttons, they have you'll see this word down at the bottom that says synapses. So the terminal buttons come up and they almost touch the dendrites of the next neuron, but there's a small space in between the terminal buttons and the dendrites. This small space is called a synapse. All right. And if you're looking at the synapse over here, you're going to notice that the arrow comes down. That's the action potential coming down the axon. And then you'll see it ends in a terminal button. They show you the picture over on the left side. They show you the larger zoomed out picture. And then they show you what it looks like if you zoom in right to the space between the terminal button and the dendrite. Now, here's what we're going to do. We're going to call everything in the terminal button where the action potential is, you're going to call that presynaptic, okay? Because it's before the synapse. And then when we look at the receptor sites, those are on the dendrites of the next neuron, and those are called postsynaptic. Okay, so if you read anything about neurology or neurochemical functioning, they're going to use the words presynaptic and postsynaptic to describe this little gap right here. Now, what you need to know is that as the pulse of electricity comes down the axon, when it gets to the terminal button, what it's going to do is it's going to cause these neurotransmitters to be released into the synapse. So the little presynaptic the presynaptic membrane is going to become porous, and those chemicals are going to pour right, those neurotransmitter chemicals are going to pour right out into the synapse. Now, in the postsynaptic membrane, you're going to have these proteins, and these proteins are each shaped specially, just like a lock, and they are going to be activated by a very specific chemical that fits them just like a key. And so some of your postsynaptic proteins are going to be shaped so that serotonin works on them. You're going to have other postsynaptic proteins that are going to be shaped differently, and they're only going to work when dopamine, the chemical dopamine, activates them. And so you're going to have these different postsynaptic proteins, each sensitive to a different type of chemical. Now, in your presynaptic terminal button, some of these buttons are going to contain, different types of neurotransmitter chemicals that they can dump into that synapse. Now, neurotransmitters have typically one of two functionings. Sometimes a neurotransmitter causes the postsynaptic neuron to become excited. They're called excitatory neurotransmitters. And sometimes when a neurotransmitter is released, it causes the next neuron to become less depolarized, or it inhibits that postsynaptic neuron. So chemicals, these neurotransmitter chemicals, either will cause the next neuron to become excited, or to become more excited, or to become less excited. Okay, now this is very complex because serotonin in some parts of your brain is excitatory, but in other parts of your brain it's inhibitory. Acetylcholine, another neurotransmitter, causes excitement in one part of your brain, but less excitement or inhibition in other parts of your brain. So it's not so much determined by the chemical neurotransmitter as by the place and the chemical. The chemical functioning of our brain is very, very complex. Okay, now neurotransmitters are then released into this synapse and they work very, very quickly. Neurotransmitters work locally and quickly. They are released in very specific places. They send one quick message and then they are pulled back into the presynaptic terminal button. Okay, now this happens two ways. Sometimes the chemicals are actually sucked back up through the presynaptic membrane. This process is called reuptake. Reuptake. But do you remember where I told you that our glial cells are responsible for cleaning intracellular waste? Well, we have glial cells in other amino acids, not amino acids, but chemicals, I forget the name of them, that are responsible, or enzymes that are responsible for cleaning up this intracellular space. All right. So neurotransmitters, they send their message across that synapse, then they go back, then they're sucked back up into the presynaptic terminal. And this is sort of how your brain works. You've got this neuron. So if we went back to, if we went back to this picture, maybe right here, right? This picture of the neuron that you're looking at, all right? So if I went way up here, do you see my little arrow where I'm waving it over here? Yes, you do. All right, so neurotransmitters, another neuron could be secreting a neurotransmitter that causes this neuron to get excited. If it secretes enough of this neurotransmitter, that message will travel all the way down to my cell body down here, right? Which will then generate a pulse of electricity, which will travel down this axon right here, causing a chemical to be released over here that then connects to the next neuron. So we have this crazy process, if you will, of chemicals being secreted, causing electrical effects in a different part that travel to a different part of the brain and cause a chemical to be secreted there. Does this make any sense? Do you already know this? Maybe I'm telling you something you already know, or maybe this makes no sense because I'm not describing it correctly. If you're still out there, go ahead and send me a chat and let me know you know what I'm talking about. Or ask me a question. Please ask me a question. This would be the time for you to ask me a question. Okay, I'm going to carry on with no questions. Now, there are actually lots of chemicals in your brain that act as neurotransmitters. And the definition of a neurotransmitter is any molecule that can be released from a neuron that communicates with other neurons. There are lots of molecules that can be released by neurons that cause other neurons to become stimulated. But there are 7 of them that really do most of the work. And they're listed over here on this chart. They're acetylcholine, norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine, gamma aminobutyric acid or GABA, glutamate, and endorphins. On the exam, I am more likely to ask you about. Okay. Well, I'm not saying I'm an expert here. I'm doing my best. So sometimes I will be confusing or vague contradictory. So what I'd like for you to know at the end of the semester, and you will know, are what the basic functions of these neurotransmitters are. Acetylcholine is very important for attention, memory, and focusing so that you can remember stuff. Okay, in order for you to really focus, your brain needs to secrete acetylcholine so you can pay attention and learn something. Uh, Norepinephrine is actually, have you ever heard of noradrenaline, epinephrine, adrenaline? This is sort of an arousal neurotransmitter. Right. Okay. This is an arousal neurotransmitter. Now, the weird thing is, norepinephrine is a great demonstration of how neurotransmitters can both be inhibitory or excitatory. Norepinephrine, when it's released in your peripheral nervous system around your heart, causes your heart to beat really, really fast so that you can run. It's adrenaline, right? However, norepinephrine that's released in your frontal lobe is inhibitory. It allows you to control your impulses, so it's sort of inhibitory. So neurotransmitters can both be excitatory or inhibitory. Now, you folks are familiar with serotonin because if you have depression, you take serotonin enhancing drugs. Serotonin is associated with mood control. Uh, dopamine. Dopamine. People with Parkinson's disorder have the part of their brain that creates dopamine is damaged, and their brain doesn't produce enough dopamine. So dopamine helps you keep smooth motor behaviors so that you can walk and move around. And you'll notice people with Parkinson's disorder, they shake and have trouble controlling their body. Dopamine is very important for motor control so you can move smoothly. GABA. GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter as a general rule, and what it does is it reduces your level of arousal and anxiety. If you have ever taken Xanaxes because you are anxious, Xanaxes magnify the amount of GABA in your nervous system. You don't have enough GABA, you start to feel nervous. You take a Xanax, it multiplies the amount of GABA in your brain and you relax. Glutamate is important for memory. Glutamate is definitely important for long-term memory. So you'll need the acetylcholine to go to school and pay attention enough to remember things. But if you're actually making those long-term memory traits, it's because your brain is releasing glutamate as you study. And then endorphins were actually the first neurotransmitter identified almost 70 years ago. And they're responsible for when you do something that makes you feel good, your body's going to release endorphins. We also talk about it, it's also implicated in this thing called the runner's high. If you've ever been a person who jogs a lot, you'll notice that the first few minutes of jogging don't feel great. But at some point during the jog, you'll notice that you actually begin to feel really good. And that's because your body is releasing endorphins that are washing over your body, making you feel good. Okay? Now, last couple of things I want to talk about. This chemical functioning in our brain is very carefully orchestrated by our brain. It's a dance between chemicals being released in certain parts of our brain at certain times. And in order for your brain to function properly, it has to have the correct kind of chemicals coursing through the brain in the right place at the right time. Now, your brain, actually, there is sort of a net a filter, if you will, that keeps all of the chemicals and molecules out of your brain. It's called the blood-brain barrier, and it's this fatty filter, if you will, that keeps most chemicals from getting into your brain so that the chemical functioning in your brain is not disrupted. However, there are certain molecules that are small enough to fit through this filter. Molecules that are small enough to fit through this filter and are shaped in ways that mimic these neurotransmitters are drugs that can have an effect on your brain. We call these drugs collectively psychoactive drugs. Now, what drugs are we talking about? Well, I'm talking about illegal drugs like THC, like cocaine, like legal recreational drugs like alcohol, things like caffeine, things like nicotine, any medication that your doctor gives you for a psychological problem you may be having. These are all examples of psychoactive drugs, okay? And the reason that these things from illegal to recreational to medical, they are all psychoactive because these molecules are small enough to get into your brain and are also shaped in such a way that the brain accidentally interprets them as neurotransmitters. Okay? Now, these psychoactive drugs modulate the functioning of your brain system. Modulate means change the functioning of your nervous system. And you know what? I take that back. A drug doesn't necessarily have to fit and be properly shaped to fit into that protein site. It can actually function several different ways. Now, these chemicals that small enough to pass through the blood-brain barrier and affect neurotransmitter functioning are called neuromodulators or psychoactive drugs. Now, they work generally in two fashions. If you think about it, neurotransmitters work in two fashions. They either stimulate a part of the brain or they decrease the stimulate or they inhibit part of the brain. That's what neurotransmitters do. So, neuromodulating drugs either work against that neurotransmitter or they help that neurotransmitter work. Now, some drugs, known as agonists, magnify the effect of a neurotransmitter. So, people who suffer from depression are hypothesized to have low levels of serotonin in their brain. So what they do is they take drugs called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs. And what these drugs do is they keep the serotonin that is in your brain in your synapse longer. Remember I told you neurotransmitters send one quick message, then they're sucked back up into the terminal button? Well, SSRIs prevent the serotonin from being sucked back up into the terminal button. So SSRIs act as agonists. They magnify the amount of serotonin that is in your brain. Now, some psychoactive drugs are what we call neurotransmitter antagonists. What they do is they work against the effect of a neurotransmitter. They impair the functioning of a neurotransmitter. Now, there is something called the dopamine hypothesis for schizophrenia. It is hypothesized that schizophrenic symptoms, especially hallucinations and delusions, are caused by too much dopamine in your nervous system. It's called the dopamine hypothesis. So, too much dopamine in your brain causes you to have hallucinations and delusions. Now, what psychologists do in an attempt to get rid of these delusions and hallucinations is they give you a drug, Thorazine being the most famous, the first and most famous of all these drugs. They give you this drug Thorazine, and what it does is it works against the dopamine in your system, which appears to reduce the amount and severity of schizophrenic hallucinations. Okay? So, if you it's kind of interesting. Actually, we can take dopamine as a cool thing. So, too much dopamine leads to schizophrenia. Too little dopamine, Parkinson's. Okay? So for schizophrenia, we give a dopamine antagonist, Thorazine. Okay? So it works to lower the dopamine. On the other hand, for people with Parkinson's, we give them L-DOPA, and their brain turns this into more dopamine. So for them, they take, so this is what we would call an antagonist, antagonist. And this is what we would call an agonist. All right? I hope that makes sense. All right? So, and sort of the bummer of it is in the current state of clinical psychology, we think of this chemical functioning as the, well, actually, no, you tell me. You tell me. The only problem with this system, is that it's sort of too simple to really be useful. So what if I had a person with Parkinson's disorder who was also schizophrenic? What would I do with this person? What would I do with a person who had Parkinson's and schizophrenia? Can anybody tell me what the problem is? Okay. All right, to finish up one last moment, we'll talk about this a little bit when we come to chapter 10, sex and gender. But it turns out that these dendrites in your nervous system are also sensitive to chemicals called hormones. Now, hormones act just like neurotransmitters, except they don't work quite as quickly, but they are released into your blood and work systemically. All right? So, there are organs in your brain that release hormones. They're called your endocrine system. And you'll see the picture right under here. We have the pineal gland, the pituitary gland, the thyroid, adrenal glands, ovaries, and testes. These are all glands in your brain that release hormones. And these hormones are actually able to activate dendrites just like neurotransmitters are. However, they're released by your body, so they work all over your body instead of one particular part of the brain or nervous system. And because they are diffused through the blood system, they take a little bit longer to get to where they're going. Now, when we get to chapter 10 and we talk about sex and gender, we're going to talk about the hormones testosterone and estrogen and how they affect the functions of the body. When we are in chapter, I think it's 11, talking about stress and coping, we're going to talk about cortisol, which is a stress hormone that is released by your adrenal glands. But we're going to talk about these in more detail on another lecture. Okay. One last note before we go. I don't know if you knew this, but a nerve is not the same thing as a neuron. A nerve is a bundle of neurons. Do you see each of these little blue circles down here? Each of these blue circles is an axon encased in the yellow myelin sheath composed of glials. What you'll notice is that you don't have one neuron here, you have hundreds of neurons here together. And a collection of neurons is called a nerve. So don't mess up. Don't be incorrect when you talk about the difference between nerves and neurons. A nerve is not a neuron. A nerve is a bundle of axons from a neuron. And remember, some of these neurons go from your brain to your body. We call those motor neurons. And some of these neurons come from your body to tell your brain what you're feeling. And we'll call these sensory nerves composed of sensory neurons. And we'll talk about this a little bit tomorrow. You'll notice that when you talk about bundles of neurons in your brain, they don't call them nerves anymore. They'll actually call them tracts. And we'll talk about tracts and efferents and afferents tomorrow morning. But if you'll look over here, what I want you to see is that there are lots of different pathways in your brain tracks. Just like you have nerves that go down the length of your arm, you have different nerves going through your brain. You will not have to know these nerves for the exam, I promise you. These are just pictures for your interest only. Okay? All right. That's all I had to say today. What I wanted you to get out of this lecture was the parts of a neuron, and I wanted you to understand that neurons work electrochemically. They are stimulated in one part of your brain and they generate electricity, which causes chemicals to be released in another part of your brain or nervous system. I wanted you to understand the importance of glial cells and how they support neurons. And I want you to be familiar with at least what serotonin and dopamine do. Those are the ones I think that are going to be on the exam. In fact, I'm positive that it's serotonin and dopamine. Only two you really have to know. Okay, folks, that's all I have to say today. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me a text or email. And otherwise, have a great week, and I will see you on Thursday. Take care. Have a great day.